She caught her boss doing something unimaginable.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The atmosphere in David Alarcon's restaurant carried a false sense of tranquility, as if everyone were playing their part in a long-rehearsed play. The aroma from the open kitchen filled the air, but behind the elaborate dishes, worries and schemes lingered. David, tall yet gaunt, stepped into his office after a tense meeting with investors. He closed the door, his eyes shutting tightly, and placed a hand on his chest as if to suppress the pain surging within. Christopher, David's longtime assistant, waited outside the door with a look of concern on his face, though his eyes gleamed with calculation. "Boss, do you want me to bring up today's report?" he asked, his voice sweet but insincere. Without turning around, David curtly replied, "No, just leave it." In the kitchen, Mariah had just finished plating her dessert. She quickly wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes shining with determination. This was the biggest opportunity of her life, working at a prestigious restaurant under David's leadership. But no one had told her that this boss was a man as cold as he was intimidating. "Mariah, you did well today," said her colleague Michael as he walked by. "But remember, don't get too involved in David's business. Nobody here wants any trouble." Mariah nodded, offering a faint smile. Yet she couldn't help but feel curious. Why did a man as successful as David always seem burdened with such sorrow in his eyes? That evening, after everyone had left, Mariah stayed behind to clean. She was startled by a noise coming from David's office. At first, she intended to ignore it, but her curiosity got the better of her. She gently pushed the door open and peered inside. David was seated on a chair, his hand trembling as he injected something into his arm. The pain etched on his face made him wince, sweat dripping from his forehead. The sight left Mariah frozen in place. The powerful man she admired was hiding something terrible. "What are you doing here?" David's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. Mariah jumped, the door creaking open fully. I was just cleaning." David stood abruptly, his gaze furious. "Get out. And remember, if you tell anyone about this, you'll lose your job immediately." "I wasn't going to say anything. Mariah stammered. "Get out now." David barked. Mariah lowered her head and left the room, her heart heavy. She didn't know what she had just witnessed, but part of her could feel the immense pain David was enduring. He wasn't just a stern boss, he was fighting his own battles. The next morning, during the staff breakfast, Michael and Helen, a veteran server, were chatting about David. "David's looking worse by the day," Helen whispered, her eyes reflecting concern. "He doesn't seem well, but he won't let anyone help him." Michael scoffed. "He just likes to pretend he's perfect. Whatever's wrong with him, he'll keep it to himself." "By the way, Mariah, you look distracted. What's up?" Mariah startled, "Nothing. I just didn't sleep well." But she knew that wasn't the truth. The image of David in pain from the previous night kept replaying in her mind. Part of her wanted to forget and move on, but another part felt compelled to do something to help him. As everyone returned to work, Christopher entered the kitchen, his gaze landing on Mariah. "Mariah, I heard you were the last one to leave the restaurant last night." Mariah nodded. "Yes, I stayed to clean as usual." Christopher smiled, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful not to get involved in things that aren't your business." The warning sent a chill down Mariah's spine. Christopher knew something, or perhaps he was just trying to intimidate her. Either way, Mariah sensed that there was something deeply wrong with this man. A week passed since the night Mariah had witnessed David's pain in his office. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind constantly drifted to him. Despite his shouting and threats, she couldn't shake off the growing sympathy she felt for him. That evening, after everyone had left, Mariah stayed in the kitchen to prepare ingredients for the next day. The sound of footsteps startled her. When she turned around, she saw Christopher standing in the doorway, a sly smirk on his face. "You're really hard-working, Mariah. But lately, you seem a bit more interested in David than you should be, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Mariah frowned but kept her composure. "I'm just doing my job. If you have nothing else to say, I'd like to get back to work." Christopher stepped into the kitchen, standing close to her. "I just want to remind you David isn't someone you should get close to. He's not the kind of man who shares anything with anyone. Understand?" Mariah took a deep breath, trying to hide her irritation. "I understand my role perfectly, thank you." Christopher chuckled before walking away. As his figure disappeared, Mariah exhaled in relief, but unease crept into her heart. She knew Christopher wasn't a simple man. He always sought control, and now, she was in his sights. The next morning, Mariah prepared a special breakfast tray for David, carefully selecting dishes that would nourish someone dealing with health issues. She hesitated outside his office before finally knocking. "Come in," David's voice called, as cold as ever. Mariah entered, setting the tray on his desk. "I thought you should eat something to regain your strength." David looked at her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What are you trying to do, Mariah? Win my favor? Or make me forget what you saw the other night?" "I'm not," Mariah replied, her voice steady. "I just want to help. I know you don't need anyone's pity, but you can't ignore your health." David smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You think you know me, Mariah? You know nothing. Stop wasting your time." Mariah met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I don't know everything, but I know what pain feels like. I've experienced it too, though maybe not in the same way as you." For a moment, David looked taken aback by her words, but he quickly turned away, avoiding her gaze. "Enough. Leave. And take that tray with you. I don't need it." Mariah clenched her fists, holding back her disappointment. "I'll leave the tray here. You don't have to eat it now, but you should think about your health." With that, she left the room without waiting for his response. In that moment, she felt as if she were stepping into an uphill battle. But instead of fear, she felt more determined than ever. Elsewhere in the restaurant, Christopher sat with Helen during the lunch break. Helen, a seasoned employee, often appeared loyal but occasionally indulged in gossip. "Mariah seems overly interested in David, doesn't she?" Christopher remarked, his eyes cold. Helen shrugged. "She's new, probably just trying to impress him. But I doubt David will pay her any attention. He's not the kind to open up easily." Christopher smirked. "Exactly. But sometimes, people who try too hard end up complicating things." Helen glanced at him, sensing something off in Christopher's tone. However, she didn't dare ask further questions and simply nodded in agreement to stay on his good side. That evening, Mariah decided to stay later than usual. She brought with her a cookbook she had read as a child, filled with recipes designed to restore health. One thought dominated her mind: finding a way to help David without making him feel pitied. As Mariah focused intently on her book, a voice suddenly sounded behind her. "Still here?" Startled, Mariah turned to see Michael standing at the kitchen door, holding a cup of coffee. "Michael, you scared me." Michael shrugged and stepped inside, sitting down beside her. "You know, I've worked here for over 10 years, but I've never seen anyone like you. You actually care about David, don't you?" Mariah gave a faint smile. "I don't know. Maybe I just don't want to see him like that. He can be difficult, but he doesn't deserve to go through it alone." Michael studied her for a moment before speaking softly, "Be careful, Mariah. David isn't someone who easily trusts others, and Christopher, he's worse than you think. If he figures out you're trying to help David, he won't let it slide." Mariah nodded, thanking Michael. Yet his warning only strengthened her resolve. If David couldn't protect himself, then she would do it even if it meant facing consequences. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew increasingly tense. Mariah's visit to David's office a few days earlier had become a source of hushed gossip among the staff. Though no one dared to speak openly, their curiosity was clearly directed at the unusual dynamic between the boss and the new chef. Christopher seemed to pay even more attention to Mariah. He started appearing in the kitchen more often than usual, his gaze scrutinizing her every move. Mariah felt his watchful eyes but tried to remain calm. She didn't want to get caught up in the web of intrigue she could sense enveloping the restaurant. That morning, Mariah decided to prepare another nutritious meal for David. She carefully selected the ingredients and cooked them with great attention to detail. When she entered his office, David was seated at his desk, holding a stack of documents, his eyes distant as if lost in thought. Mariah gently set the tray down on the desk. "I just brought you some breakfast. You should eat to keep your strength up." David looked up, his sharp gaze piercing through her. "I told you before, I don't need anyone's pity." Mariah took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. "This isn't pity. I just want to help. You may not like me, but at least think about your health." David scoffed, setting the documents down. "You think you understand me, Mariah? You know nothing. I've been through more than anyone here. If I have to endure pain, it's the price I pay to keep what I've built." Mariah met his gaze, her expression steady. "I don't need to understand everything. But I know one thing, no one can do everything alone forever. If you don't let others help, you'll only make things worse." David remained silent for a long moment before standing. "You don't understand. You don't need to involve yourself in my business. Focus on your own work." Mariah said nothing more. She bowed her head and left the room, feeling disappointed. She had tried her best, but it seemed David refused to let anyone get close. Still, she knew she couldn't give up. In another corner of the restaurant, Christopher was sitting with Eduardo, a young manager. Eduardo was smart but often unknowingly drawn into Christopher's schemes. "What do you think of the new chef, Mariah?" Christopher asked, his tone probing. Eduardo shrugged. "She seems talented, but she does seem a bit too concerned about Mr. David." Christopher smirked. "Exactly. But she doesn't seem to know her place. She's starting to do things that aren't her responsibility." Eduardo frowned. "What do you mean?" Christopher patted Eduardo's shoulder, his smile laced with hidden intent. "We need to make sure no one disrupts the order here. That chef needs a lesson to understand her position." Eduardo didn't reply, but a sense of unease settled in his chest. Although Christopher was his superior, his words always left him feeling unsettled. That night, Mariah decided to review the kitchen's inventory records. She noticed a few discrepancies. The quantities of ingredients ordered didn't match the amounts reported. This wasn't the first time she'd noticed such issues, but the difference this time was much larger than usual. "What's going on here?" Mariah muttered to herself, flipping through the pages. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps startled her. Turning around, she saw Christopher standing at the doorway, his expression cold. "What are you doing here this late, Mariah?" he asked, his tone interrogative. Mariah forced herself to stay calm. "I was just checking the inventory. I noticed some discrepancies." Christopher stepped closer, standing uncomfortably near. "You haven't been here long, but you seem to be taking an interest in too many things that aren't your concern." "This is my responsibility," Mariah replied, meeting his gaze. "If something doesn't add up, I need to report it." Christopher chuckled dryly. "I don't think you understand how things work around here. There are some things it's better not to be too curious about." Each word felt like a threat. But instead of showing fear, Mariah gave a slight nod and tucked the inventory book into a drawer. "I understand. I'll be more careful." Christopher lingered for a moment before turning and walking away. Once he was gone, Mariah let out a shaky breath. She knew she had stepped into dangerous territory. But if Christopher was indeed involved in wrongdoing, she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. That night, Mariah couldn't sleep. Her suspicions about Christopher and the irregularities in the restaurant plagued her thoughts. She recalled Michael's warning, "Christopher isn't someone you deal with easily." Staring out the window as moonlight streamed through, Mariah knew that continuing down this path could bring trouble. Yet, she also knew she couldn't back down. David needed help, even if he wouldn't admit it. And if Christopher was truly up to something, she would find a way to stop him no matter how difficult it became. The next morning, the restaurant was bustling more than usual. A VIP group was scheduled for lunch, keeping everyone busy with preparations. Mariah continued her work as usual, but the constant feeling of being watched by Christopher lingered. David also made an appearance in the kitchen that morning, a rare occurrence. His gait was slightly unsteady, but his gaze remained commanding. Everyone in the kitchen fell silent as he entered, the only sounds coming from knives chopping and pans clattering. "How's everything coming along?" David asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Michael quickly stepped forward to respond. "Everything is on schedule, sir. The main course and dessert will be ready on time." David nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Mariah. He didn't say anything, merely giving her an indecipherable look before walking out. Mariah felt her chest tighten but kept her head down, focusing on her work and trying to stay calm. When lunchtime ended and the VIP guests left satisfied, the tension in the kitchen eased. Mariah prepared a tray of light refreshments for David, knowing he might reject it as usual. When she knocked on his office door, there was no response. Mariah hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open. David was slumped over his desk, sweat beading on his pale face. "Are you okay?" Mariah asked, her voice laced with concern. David lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes revealing his pain. "Get out. I don't need your help. But you need rest, David. If you keep pushing yourself like this." Mariah stepped closer, setting the tray down on the desk. "At least eat something." David slammed his hand on the desk, making the tray rattle. "I said I don't need it. Don't you understand?" Mariah took a step back but didn't break eye contact. "I can't just stand by and watch you destroy yourself like this." David took a deep breath, his anger softening slightly. "You don't understand, Mariah. Do you think you can change anything? I don't need anyone's pity." "This isn't pity," Mariah replied, her gaze unwavering. "I just don't want to see someone like you defeated by yourself." David didn't respond, turning his head away, his expression distant. Mariah understood he didn't want to continue the conversation, so she bowed her head and left the room. Before closing the door, she quietly said, "I won't stop trying to help you, whether you want it or not." Meanwhile, in a small storage room elsewhere in the restaurant, Christopher was meeting with a stranger. He handed the man a folder. "This is all the information I've gathered. We need to act soon before David can retaliate," Christopher whispered. The man flipped through the documents and nodded. "He's weakened a lot. This is the perfect time to move." Christopher smirked. "Exactly. But there's a small problem, Mariah. She's interfering too much. I need to make sure she can't cause more trouble." The man raised an eyebrow. "A chef? What could she possibly do?" Christopher shook his head. "She's smarter than she looks. If she learns too much, our plan could fall apart. I'll deal with her." That night, Mariah was double-checking some inventory in the storeroom when Michael walked in. He glanced around before whispering, "Are you okay, Mariah?" Mariah turned to him, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine. It's just, there are things I don't know how to handle." Michael stepped closer, his expression serious. "Christopher is planning something. I don't know the details, but he's not someone to underestimate. You need to be careful. I know, Mariah sighed. I've noticed some irregularities in the inventory records. I think he might be up to something. Michael nodded. If you suspect something, don't act alone. He's dangerous. Mariah looked at him, gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, Michael. I'll be careful. In his office, David sat at his desk, holding a small wooden box. Inside were old photographs of his family, memories of a life long gone. David hadn't always been so lonely. He once had a happy family, but his career had taken everything from him. Helen, his ex-wife, had left him after years of enduring his rigid and controlling nature. David had always tried to keep everything under his control, but that only drove people away. Now, all he had left was his business, but his deteriorating health reminded him that even this wouldn't last much longer. David closed his eyes, feeling the pain spreading through his body. He didn't know how much longer he could continue. Yet a small part of him couldn't help but think of Mariah. Her determination and kindness stirred a flicker of hope in him, though he would never admit it. At his home, Christopher was plotting his next move. He opened his laptop and entered a few commands, altering the restaurant's financial records. He wanted to create a significant discrepancy and frame Mariah, forcing her out of the picture before she uncovered too much. Christopher chuckled to himself. Don't blame me, Mariah. You're just a pawn in this game. The next morning in the restaurant kitchen, the atmosphere was heavy. Mariah tried to concentrate on her work, but Christopher's constant presence made her feel suffocated. He acted friendly with everyone, but his cold gaze whenever he looked at her was a silent warning that he was watching her every move. Mariah glanced at Michael, the only person in the kitchen she felt she could trust. But even Michael seemed more cautious than usual, as if he too sensed the rising tension. Mariah, Michael whispered as he passed her. Be careful. Christopher has been watching you all morning. Mariah pressed her lips together and nodded, continuing her work. But she couldn't shake the unease growing inside her. That evening, after the restaurant closed, Mariah decided to review the records again. She believed the irregularities in the ingredient inventory could provide more insight into Christopher's plan. She carefully opened the storage cabinet and began combing through the files. The numbers didn't match the quantities of ingredients ordered, and the records of what was actually received were inconsistent. Mariah frowned as she flipped through the pages, searching for any clues. Then she noticed something strange: several invoices signed by Christopher, but the dates didn't align with any transactions she knew of. This could be evidence, Mariah muttered to herself, though she wasn't sure what to do next. She knew that reporting this without sufficient proof could backfire, and Christopher might easily turn the situation against her. As Mariah pored over the documents, the storeroom door suddenly swung open, startling her. Christopher stepped in, a cold smile on his face. It's late, Mariah. What are you doing here? He asked, his tone light but menacing. Mariah quickly hid the notebook in her hand, trying to appear calm. I was just double-checking the inventory. I noticed some discrepancies. Christopher stepped closer, his gaze piercing. You don't need to worry about those things. That's not your job. But if there's an issue, I think it's my responsibility to report it, Mariah said, keeping her voice steady. Christopher chuckled, but the sound was devoid of warmth. Listen, Mariah. I suggest you focus on your cooking. You've only been here for a short time, but you seem far too curious. Mariah pressed her lips together, choosing not to respond. She understood that Christopher's words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. The next morning, Mariah felt more tense than ever. Christopher wasn't just keeping a close eye on her, he seemed to be going out of his way to make her job difficult. He frequently made negative remarks about her work in front of their colleagues, causing some of them to question her competence. Mariah, are you sure you checked that dish properly before sending it out? It looks a bit unprofessional, Christopher said loudly in the kitchen, drawing everyone's attention. Michael frowned, about to defend Mariah, but she shook her head, signaling him not to intervene. "I'll double-check it." "Thank you for pointing it out," Mariah replied calmly, though irritation bubbled inside her. She could feel pitying glances from some of her co-workers, but she refused to let them discourage her. She knew she needed to be extra careful because Christopher was clearly trying to get rid of her. That evening, Mariah decided not to return to the records. Instead, she resolved to speak with David. She knew her boss might be the only one capable of standing up to Christopher. But David remained a difficult figure, cold, distant, and deeply distrustful. Mariah knocked on David's office door, her anxiety mounting. When he allowed her in, she stepped inside and stood before his desk, trying to remain composed. "David, I need to talk to you," Mariah began. David looked up, his expression icy. "About what?" Mariah took a deep breath. "I think Christopher is doing something wrong. I reviewed the records and found some discrepancies. I don't know exactly what he's up to, but I think you should look into it." David raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "Are you accusing my longtime assistant? Don't you think you're overstepping your bounds?" Mariah kept her tone steady. "I'm not accusing anyone. I just want you to know something doesn't seem right. If you want, I can show you the documents I found." David was silent for a moment, then stood and approached her. "Listen, Mariah. I know you mean well, but you don't understand how things work here. Christopher has been someone I've trusted for years. If you want to keep working here, it's best you don't involve yourself in matters that aren't your concern." His words felt like a bucket of cold water poured over Mariah. Disappointment and helplessness flooded her, but instead of arguing, she simply bowed her head and replied softly, "I understand." Mariah turned and left the office, but deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. Even if David didn't believe her, she was certain that Christopher was dangerous. And if her boss wouldn't act, she would have to find a way to uncover the truth herself. In his office, David sat back down, staring at the door Mariah had just closed. Her words echoed in his mind. Though he didn't want to admit it, part of him felt she might be right. Christopher, despite his loyalty, had been acting strangely lately. But with his declining health and exhaustion, David wasn't sure if he had the strength to confront the truth. Christopher wasn't oblivious. After Mariah's conversation with David, he quickly realized she was no longer just a chef. Her quiet efforts were threatening the plan he had been crafting for years to take over the business. This realization pushed him to act immediately. That evening, in his office, Christopher made a phone call to a familiar contact, his voice firm and decisive. "We need to move the plan forward. David's getting weaker, but I need to make sure Mariah doesn't cause any more trouble." The person on the other end chuckled. "A chef? Are you sure she's worth worrying about?" "She is," Christopher replied without hesitation. "She's smarter than she looks. She's already suspicious and had the audacity to speak directly to David. If we wait too long, she'll figure everything out." "What's your plan?" the voice asked. Christopher's tone turned cold. "I'll take her out of the game. But first, I need to make sure David completely loses trust in her." The next morning, the restaurant bustled as usual, but Mariah felt every eye on her. Something wasn't right, and her unease grew when Michael approached her, his face full of concern. "Mariah, have you heard?" Michael whispered. "Heard what?" Mariah asked, frowning. Michael glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Christopher's been telling people there are issues with your records. He's spreading rumors that you've been embezzling money for ingredients." Mariah's heart sank. "What? That's impossible. I haven't done anything." "I know," Michael said. "But Christopher is very good at making accusations stick. He's trying to turn everyone against you." Mariah looked at Michael, her eyes filled with desperation. "What should I do?" If everyone believes him, I'll have no way to clear my name. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I believe you, Mariah. But you need to protect yourself. If you have evidence, keep it safe. In the conference room, Christopher presented a financial report to David and several stakeholders. His report was flawless, meticulously crafted to hide illegal transactions. After the meeting, David called Christopher aside. Christopher, I want you to review all the supply transactions from the past month. Some reports have flagged discrepancies. Christopher raised an eyebrow but quickly regained his composure. I'll check immediately, sir. It's probably just a data entry error. David nodded, but his eyes stayed on Christopher. While he wasn't fully convinced of Mariah's claims, doubt about his longtime assistant began to creep in. That evening, Mariah returned to the records. She knew she was facing a dangerous adversary, but she couldn't sit idly by while Christopher manipulated everything. She needed more evidence before bringing the truth to David. As Mariah combed through the files, the storeroom door swung open. Christopher stepped inside, his expression colder than ever. Still at it, Mariah? He asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Mariah stood tall, meeting his gaze. I'm not doing anything wrong. But you are. I know you're hiding something, Christopher. Christopher chuckled darkly. Who do you think you are to say that? You're just a chef who hasn't been here long. No one will believe you. I don't need anyone to believe me, Mariah replied firmly. The truth will come out eventually. Christopher stepped closer, his voice lowering into a menacing tone. If you were smart, you'd leave before things get worse. I can make your life hell, Mariah. Mariah's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. I'm not afraid of you, Christopher. You can try, but I won't let you destroy this place. Christopher smirked cruelly. Fine. Let's see who wins. With that, he turned and left, leaving Mariah standing there, fear and determination battling within her. In his office, David sat alone, staring at a folder on his desk. Mariah's words echoed in his mind. He didn't want to believe that Christopher, the assistant he had trusted for years, could betray him. Yet, he couldn't deny that Christopher's recent behavior had been unusual. David felt exhausted. He was not only battling his worsening illness but also dealing with chaos within his own company. He knew he couldn't handle everything alone, but he also wasn't sure who he could trust. For a moment, David looked out the window, where the moonlight illuminated the night sky. Part of him wanted to call Mariah back and hear more, but his pride and lingering doubts held him back. David told himself he needed to uncover the truth on his own, no matter how difficult it might be. The next morning, the atmosphere in the restaurant was more tense than ever. Mariah realized that Christopher wasn't just trying to undermine her, he was pushing her into a corner. Her colleagues looked at her with suspicion, and some even whispered malicious rumors. I heard Mariah is involved in embezzling money from the restaurant, a server whispered to another in the corner of the kitchen. I don't know, but if Christopher says so, there must be something to it, the other replied, their eyes filled with doubt. Those whispers didn't escape Mariah's ears. Though she knew she was innocent, the words still hurt deeply. She looked around for Michael, the only person she felt she could trust, but he wasn't there. In his office, David sat across from Christopher. The assistant presented him with a folder filled with carefully manipulated numbers, designed to highlight the errors he had attributed to Mariah. Mr. David, here is the report I just completed. I'm sorry to say that Mariah doesn't appear to have been honest in her work. I think it's best we act immediately before this gets out of hand, Christopher said, his tone dripping with feigned dedication. David took the folder, his eyes scanning the numbers, though his mind was clouded with doubt. Are you sure, Christopher? I don't want to accuse anyone without clear evidence. Sir, this is the evidence, Christopher replied firmly. These figures don't lie. I'm afraid she has taken advantage of your trust. David didn't respond immediately, but his expression darkened. He placed the folder down on the desk, feeling deeply conflicted. Mariah had openly spoken to him about irregularities in the company, and now Christopher was accusing her. Who could he truly trust? That evening, Mariah decided to confront David again. She knew time was running out, and if she didn't act, Christopher would win. She knocked on David's office door, his voice calling out from inside. "Come in." Mariah entered, her eyes filled with determination. "David, I need to talk to you. I know you think I've done something wrong, but I have proof to show you the truth." David looked at her, his gaze cold yet tinged with hesitation. "What proof?" Mariah pulled out a set of documents she had quietly gathered over the past few days. "These are what I found. These invoices don't match the actual transactions. And all of them are signed by Christopher." David took the documents, flipping through the pages. With each page he read, his expression grew graver. "Are you certain about this?" "Yes," Mariah said firmly. "I've checked and double-checked. Christopher is exploiting your condition to cover up shady dealings. I know you don't want to believe it, but this is the truth." David placed the documents on his desk, his eyes fixed on Mariah. "If what you're saying is true, this changes everything. But you must understand, I can't act based solely on your word." "You don't have to trust me right away," Mariah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But at least let me help you uncover the truth." David was silent for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "All right. I'll look into this." Meanwhile, Christopher sat in his own office, smugly confident that his plan was unfolding smoothly. He had arranged for Mariah to be dismissed at the upcoming shareholder meeting, ensuring that no one would stand in his way of taking over the company. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Eduardo, the young manager, entering with a worried expression. "Christopher, I think we have a problem," Eduardo said quietly. Christopher frowned. "What problem?" Eduardo glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I heard that Mariah presented something to Mr. David. If he starts digging deeper, we're going to have trouble." Christopher let out a dismissive laugh, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Don't worry, Eduardo. David won't dare challenge me. He's weak and doesn't want to stir up conflict. We'll stick to the plan." Eduardo didn't respond, but uneasiness lingered in his chest. While he wasn't fully loyal to Christopher, he also lacked the courage to oppose him. Yet doubts began to creep in. Was he on the right side? Late at night, David sat alone in his office, the dim light casting shadows across his face. Mariah's and Christopher's documents lay side by side on his desk. One set contained clear, concrete evidence, the other was Christopher's polished report, perfect but lacking authenticity. David felt a deep internal struggle. He had trusted Christopher, who had been by his side for years. But Mariah's findings were impossible to ignore. If Christopher truly had betrayed him, everything David had spent his life building would crumble. Finally, David rose from his chair, his eyes filled with resolve. He knew he couldn't keep turning a blind eye. If he wanted to protect his company and his legacy, he had to act even if it meant confronting someone he had once considered his right hand. The next morning, the restaurant's atmosphere remained as tense as ever, but Mariah sensed a shift. David no longer maintained his cold distance. His gaze, when it landed on her, carried a thoughtful intensity, as though he was weighing something of great importance. As Mariah worked in the kitchen, Michael approached her, his expression slightly relieved. "David has called a shareholder meeting for this afternoon," he whispered. "I overheard that he plans to address everything about Christopher." Mariah looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Really? So he's finally starting to believe what I've been saying?" Michael nodded. "But be careful. Christopher isn't going to let things spiral out of his control without a fight." Mariah smiled faintly, though unease still gnawed at her. "Thank you, Michael. I'll be ready. That afternoon, the shareholder meeting took place in a formal conference room. All the major stakeholders of the restaurant were present, including Christopher and Eduardo. David sat at the head of the table, his face pale but his gaze commanding. For the first time in months, he appeared before the entire team with a sense of determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice calm yet commanding. "I have called this meeting to address serious issues concerning the finances and operations of the restaurant." Christopher smirked, leaning back in his chair with an air of confidence. He was certain everything was unfolding according to his plan. "I would like to invite someone to present their findings," David continued, his eyes turning toward the door. "Mariah, please come in." Christopher stiffened, his smirk freezing on his face. As Mariah walked in, holding a thick folder of documents, her gaze was steady and resolute. She stepped to the front and stood beside David, taking a deep breath before she began. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mariah," she said, her voice calm but resonating throughout the room. "During my time working here, I have discovered irregularities in the restaurant's financial records. These irregularities are not accidental but the result of deliberate fraudulent actions." The room fell silent. Christopher straightened in his chair, his eyes flashing with alarm. "What are you talking about? These accusations are baseless." Mariah didn't respond to him directly. Instead, she opened her folder and began presenting her evidence. She pointed out forged invoices, suspicious transactions, and documents related to inventory purchases that Christopher had deliberately manipulated. "All of these documents bear Christopher's signature," Mariah stated, her gaze fixed on him. "He has exploited Mr. David's trust to carry out these fraudulent activities for personal gain." Christopher shot to his feet, attempting to maintain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding. Everything she's saying is unfounded." David raised a hand, signaling him to sit down. "Christopher, I have trusted you for years. But if these documents are authentic, you owe me an explanation." Christopher hesitated, fumbling to maintain his confident facade. "Mr. David, I've done nothing wrong. This is a scheme to frame me." At that moment, Eduardo, the young manager, stood up, his voice trembling. "Christopher, I can't stay silent anymore. I was involved in part of your plan, but I can't continue like this." All eyes turned to Eduardo. Christopher paled, unable to hide his panic. "Eduardo, what are you talking about?" "I worked with you because I was afraid," Eduardo continued, his gaze shifting to David. "But what Mariah is saying is true. Christopher has been using his position to commit financial fraud. He forced me to participate, but I can't keep covering for him." The room erupted in murmurs. Christopher tried to protest, but the evidence and Eduardo's confession shattered his arguments. David, his face stern, looked directly at Christopher. "Christopher, you haven't just betrayed me, you've betrayed the entire team and the reputation of this restaurant. You're fired immediately, and I'll be forwarding all this evidence to the police." Christopher was speechless, unable to muster a defense. He left the meeting room in silence, the contemptuous stares of everyone following him. As the shareholders began to disperse, David stayed behind with Mariah. He sank into a chair, the weariness evident on his face. "Thank you, Mariah. Without you, I wouldn't have uncovered the truth." Mariah offered a small smile, her voice sincere. "I just wanted to do the right thing. You've built this restaurant with your heart and soul. I couldn't let it be destroyed." David looked at her, his expression softening. "I owe you an apology. I didn't trust you at first. But now, I know you're someone I can rely on." Mariah shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. Just be willing to face the challenges ahead, and I'll always be here to help." David smiled faintly, and for the first time in months, a glimmer of hope sparked within him. The shareholder meeting ended, but its impact reverberated throughout the restaurant. Everyone couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Christopher, once David's most trusted assistant, was now fired and facing legal consequences. Meanwhile, Mariah was admired for her courage in standing up for the truth. David sat alone in his office, his gaze drifting toward the faint light outside the window. The past few days had taken a toll on him, but he knew that things could now move forward in a positive direction. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," David said, his voice deep but no longer cold. Mariah entered, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She placed it on the desk in front of him, a gentle smile on her face. "I thought you could use this more than ever." David smiled, warmth finally reaching his eyes. "Thank you, Mariah. But I think I should be the one thanking you. Without you, everything might have fallen apart." Mariah sat down across from him, her tone genuine. "I just did what I thought was right. This restaurant isn't just a job, it's your legacy. I didn't want to see it ruined." David nodded, his expression contemplative. "You know, Mariah, for the first time, I feel like I don't have to face everything alone. But dealing with this illness and all the challenges, I'm not sure if I have the strength to keep going." Mariah looked at him with compassion. "You don't have to face it all alone. Michael, the team, and we're all here for you. Most importantly, you need to take care of your health first." David sighed softly, then met Mariah's gaze. "Do you think I can get through all this?" Mariah smiled, her voice steady. "I believe you can. But you have to believe in yourself first." In the following days, David began making significant changes. He decided to temporarily hand over the restaurant's operations to Michael, someone he trusted to keep things running smoothly. Meanwhile, David took time to start an intensive treatment program for his illness. Michael was surprised when David entrusted him with this responsibility. "Do you really trust me this much?" he asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. David placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his gaze steady. "Michael, you're someone I can trust. I know you'll do well. And I need this time to recover." Mariah, standing nearby, smiled at the two of them. She knew this was a difficult but necessary step for David. It made her happy to see him finally letting go of some of his burdens. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the restaurant became warmer. Under Michael's leadership and with the team's support, everything fell into place. Mariah became an indispensable right-hand person, not just in the kitchen but also in managing operations. Although David wasn't directly involved in the daily work, he frequently visited the restaurant. His health steadily improved, and his face gradually regained its vitality. The treatments not only alleviated his pain but also gave him a fresh perspective on life. One quiet evening, after the restaurant had closed and everyone had left, David remained in his office, the desk lamp casting a soft glow on his face. He had spent weeks reflecting on what Mariah had done not just for the restaurant but for him personally. Now, he couldn't deny that within his heart, feelings had begun to grow, feelings he hadn't thought himself capable of experiencing again after so many years of solitude. A gentle knock echoed on the door. David looked up, immediately knowing it was Mariah. "Come in," he said, his voice low but carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. Mariah entered, as she did every day, carrying a cup of hot tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing the cup on the desk. She turned to leave, but David called her back. "Mariah," he said softly, his gaze unusually tender. "Stay a while, will you?" Mariah hesitated, surprised by his request, but she nodded and took a seat across from him. "Is something on your mind, Mr. David?" David looked at her, silent for a moment as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've spent so many years with a closed heart. I always believed that loneliness was the price I had to pay to protect what I've built. But then you came along, Mariah. And you changed that." Mariah was taken aback but kept her eyes on him, her expression open and attentive. "What do you mean?" I've only done what I thought was necessary to help you and the restaurant. David smiled faintly. That's true. But you've done far more than I ever could have imagined. You didn't just save this restaurant, you helped me see that sometimes, letting someone into your life isn't a weakness but a way to grow stronger. Mariah's heart raced, unsure how to respond. She understood the depth of what David was saying. I just wanted you to know that you don't have to fight alone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. David reached out, gently placing his hand over hers on the table. Mariah, I'm not good at expressing my emotions. But I want you to know that I value you not just for what you've done for me but for who you are. Your kindness, determination, and courage have changed me. Mariah looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity and a hint of vulnerability. David, I don't think you need to change for me. You're already a remarkable person, you just need to give yourself the chance to see it. David chuckled softly, his gaze filled with warmth. If I could start over, I'd want you to be a part of my life, Mariah. Not just as a colleague, but as a companion. Mariah felt her cheeks grow warm, but she couldn't help smiling. I don't know what the future holds, but if you're willing to open your heart, I'll always be here. David gave her hand a gentle squeeze, conveying his gratitude and heartfelt sincerity. That night, in the quiet room, two people who had once been separated by walls of their own making found a way into each other's worlds. The story of David and Mariah reminds us that courage and sincerity can overcome even the most formidable barriers, including those built by fear and past wounds. It serves as a poignant reminder that, sometimes, we must learn to trust and open our hearts to others to find true strength in connection. Mariah's determination and kindness not only saved a restaurant but also helped David rediscover the meaning of life. Faith in truth and the power of kindness always has the strength to change everything.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.